This is the story of a herder and his sheep. All winter long, the herder camps out in the Salt River Valley near Phoenix, Arizona, where the sheep find verdant pasture. Springtime brings searing heat to this section of the state. The forage will not last throughout summer. The herd must head northward. This is the story of Rosalio Lucero, the 60-year-old Mexican herder, and of the sheep which he takes northward every spring to summer range in the cool forest of northern Arizona. The trek for forage is made principally just by the mother sheep, the ewes, which are used exclusively for breeding and for wool. They make this same journey year in, year out. Born in winter pastures, most of the lambs are sold before the trek commences. One lamb lost its mother. You can almost hear it saying, "Ma, ma." Before the long journey, the sheep lose their heavy coat of wool which had grown throughout the winter. In mid-April, Rosalio and his campero, or camp cook, Pablo, began preparations for the trek. Burros were packed with supplies for the great migration. And the owner of the herd was on hand to count the animals. In the herd under Rosalio's care were 1,547 sheep. Red-winged blackbirds, which had lived with the flocks in the pastures, were on hand to bid a wistful goodbye. On April 16th, a vast river of wool surged out of the pasture, heading northward on a 52-day grueling trek over one of the roughest sheep trails in all America. Throughout the journey, the very life of each animal would be in charge of Rosalio Lucero. He did not own these sheep. He was just working for wages. But he would guard them with his life. He had learned herding when he was a boy of 13 from his father over in New Mexico, and had been following these sheep trails for 46 years. Rosalio walked the entire distance. Behind the sheep came the burros, in charge of Pablo, who rode a horse. And behind them all came yours truly to film the trek. For a day, we followed the dusty roads of the Salt River Valley, but this was the only part of the journey with roads or trails at all. Dust churned up by the sheep clogged the throats of both men and animals. In 3 days, the herd reached the Salt River. The stream here is swift. Animals swimming it sometimes drown. So a sheep bridge has been erected just for this crossing. Sheep do not like this bridge. They were supposed to go single file, but they crowded. They went double file. They ran as swiftly as they could, sometimes jumping out of the chute and having to be driven in once more. The bridge vibrated violently under their weight, and upon reaching solid ground on the far side, they often took vigorous leaps of joy. In the confusion of crossing, one of the lambs that had been brought along to learn the trail for future years became separated from its mother. It was watchful waiting for both lamb and mother. Until at last there was a joyful reunion. The sheep had wanted to cross the bridge rapidly, but not so the burros. In fact, the government ranger who had come down to count the sheep, and even I had to lend some physical persuasion. But finally, they made it. Leaving all civilization behind, we headed into the desert. Arizona's desert in springtime is alive with color. The flaming ocatilla is appropriately called the light of the desert. The palo verde trees are showers of blossoms. There is the delicate desert poppy and the bird of paradise. Nearly every variety of cactus is gaily bedecked. Sometimes the cactus joints themselves are tinted in delicate hues. Vivid blooms nestle in thorny beds. Often the spines are colored brown or red. Growing with little moisture in hot sand which sends up searing heat waves, the cactus produces blooms nearly as delicate as orchids. The flowers attract birds, such as this desert oriole. The poet has said, "Full many a flower is born to blush unseen and waste its sweetness on the desert air. But this sweetness is not wasted. Birds and insects suck the nectar from the flowers." I found the nest of a cactus wren, which had a protection of bristling spines, for the cactus is a haven of refuge for desert birds. A mourning dove's nest was completely surrounded by cactus, a protection from desert marauders. The saguaro, or giant cactus, is a veritable apartment house with many apartments occupied. The third night out from the bridge, Rosalio began touching fire to the cholla cactus, his symbolic way of showing hatred for this plant. Cholla may be a haven of refuge for birds, but it is a great enemy of the sheep. Called the jumping cactus, its burrs adhere to the animals. They attach themselves to the sheep's feet, driving deeper into the flesh with every step, making walking difficult. Cholla burrs adhered to their noses, making grazing almost impossible. Rosalia had to drive them through. The lead sheep were pushed by those behind directly into the cholla. Their struggles to free themselves became frantic. The herder tried to catch such sheep with his staff and remove the burrs. Pablo had to drive the burros through. It was too tough a country for all the animals. Often Pablo had to stop to remove burrs from the horse. It was too tough a country for the dogs. And it was too tough a country for me. Even though the burrs can be removed with strong sticks, the spines often stay. Heavy clothing must be worn in a desert such as this. The cholla is the great enemy of both sheep and men. At mid-morning, when the desert became unbearably hot, the sheep stopped instinctively with no urging. It is called shading up, though there was usually little shade, save from an occasional ocatilla. This stopping of the sheep was the signal for Pablo to stop and begin preparation of noon camp. All the burros had to be unpacked. It was a hard task. A great fire was built, but not for heat, but because all cooking for the day had to be done at noontime. We always started too early in the morning, continued too late at night for cooking then. While we ate our food, the burros sampled nearly everything about the camp. The noon stop was an occasion for catching up on odd jobs. The horses' shoes wore out rapidly on the severe rocks of the desert. This was a frequent task of Pablo's. Because of the desert rocks, shoes were one of the biggest problems of the men. Often special protection had to be added. Water was scarce, yet a certain amount of washing needed to be done. Sabu, the goat, was a camp favorite. He was put in the lead, for the sheep will follow goats where otherwise they will not go. About 4 in the afternoon, when it began to cool a little, we would pack and be on our way once more. Always we traveled until after dark, for the desert was cooler then. But the time at twilight was the most beautiful. Here on the desert, one learned the great value of occasional solitude. No jangle of traffic, no blaring radio, no distractions. It is good to experience real solitude at times. When the sun went down, when the moon and the stars came out, that was the time of the greatest glory. The English author Priestley has called Arizona geology by day and astronomy by night. Rosalio loved the moon. He had camped out under it most of his life. He was often up much of the night caring for his sheep. One morning, long before dawn, we saw Venus, the morning star. And Rosalio told me that his last name, Lucero, in Spanish, meant morning star. There is one time that a name was well chosen, Rosalio Lucero. Rosalio, the morning star. For 7 days we followed through a desert area strewn with giant boulders and rocks. I marveled that Rosalio could keep track of the sheep. Sometimes they looked almost like the rocks themselves. At other times, they spread out over half a mile in several different canyons at once. The dogs were of little help. Rosalio had to explore each branch canyon personally to make sure that no strays were left behind. The animals, lamed by the cactus, received further injuries from the sharp rocks. Buzzards lined the trail, hoping for the loss of an animal. After a rocky area, Rosalio had to stop the herd. The sheep were counted, and if there were losses or cuts, they had to be found. For 3 days, we followed along a dry wash. Here was truly a river of flowing wool. But here, gnats, or tiny flies, harassed the herd. The sheep stopped, heads down and close together as a protection from the gnats. And Rosalio sometimes spent half an hour, morning and noon, getting the herd in motion. While small flies harassed the sheep, other insects plagued the men. Unless Pablo chose camp wisely, ants were a nuisance at night. Sometimes tarantulas and scorpions crawled on our blankets, but never once were we injured. We saw nearly all types of lizards, of course entirely harmless. Later, I encountered one lizard shedding its skin, a normal process. And on the trek, I came upon 4 Gila monsters. One day, there was a splendid example of the coon-tailed diamondback rattler, so called because its tail is striped, as in the case of a coon. With Pablo's help, I was able to work less than 4 feet from it. The snake's tongue actually had a rhythmic beauty of movement. The praying mantis is so called because it takes the attitude of prayer. Likewise, it preys on flies and insects. It is easy to see why the mantis is sometimes called the dinosaur of the desert. Most interesting to me were the horned toads, actually not a toad at all, but a member of the lizard family and entirely harmless. During a noon stop, I captured one for a pet. The sheep must graze almost constantly as they progress. Lacking grass, they often eat leaves of cat's claw and nibble blossoms of the cactus, wounding their faces severely. Now, the sheep were not only hungry, but thirsty. They had been nearly 3 days without water, and often I would find the old ewes devouring the prickly pear, for here was not only food, but a little moisture as well. There was unusual excitement when we awoke from camp on the top of Reno Pass. Ahead of us was Tonto Basin, one of the wildest sections of all America. But most important, down in that basin was Tonto Creek, the herd's first chance for water in 3 days of desert travel. Already, Rosalio had started down with the sheep, while Pablo stayed in camp to pack. This was hard work, packing and unpacking morning, noon, and night, sometimes 150 pounds to the animal. On top of the packs went the bedroll. And in those packs were nearly all of the personal possessions owned in this world by Pablo and Rosalio. Except for one vacation a year, they spend their lives camping out. When Pablo overtook Rosalio, there was an excited conference. All talk was about the water down below. As the herd headed downward in the early morning hours, they did not know yet that water lay ahead. Weary, footsore, hungry, and thirsty, they plodded slowly. But suddenly the lead sheep smelled water. The cloud of dust marking the herd shot forward toward the river. It was a mad stampede. Hastily, Pablo hobbled the burros so that they would not wander away. They showed the same frantic urge to reach that first drink in 3 days. Here, temporarily at least, was peace. Here was water. Now we would be leaving Tonto Creek, heading again into a land without water. So the kegs must be refilled. But the water needed straining, for even in a desert stream there is life. For days we followed along a plateau country. Here at last, I thought, Rosalio would have a rest from hazards, but I was wrong. We were in the land of the loco weed. He had to guard carefully against camping in loco areas at night, for the sheep might eat it, with serious results. The foxtail grass got into the eyes of the animals by day, and the herder had to remove it. Rosalio was just working for wages, but his every thought was for his sheep. Higher and higher and higher we climbed, heading toward the top of the Sierra Ancha Mountains. For 9 days we saw no ranch or road or man or fence, complete wilderness. Under the pines of the great forest, new hazards developed. There was a lack of forage. Here, sheep ate the pine needles. Goats and burros could reach higher and ate the leaves of the oaks. Lacking forage, the sheep would stampede, and Rosalio had to run much of the day to keep the herd intact. Another herder in this section once lost 300 sheep, and they were never discovered again. And immediately we plunged into an area with undergrowth so thick that sometimes it was impossible to see a dozen sheep out of the herd of 1,500. This put a new strain on Rosalio. Here the dogs were of almost no help. At night he had to guard against wild animals, coyotes, and bears. At the very summit of the Sierra Ancha range, we encountered a violent electric storm. Lightning split the air. The wind blew furiously. Thunder echoed after each blinding flash. The sheep huddled together close in fright. Rain came, and with it came danger, for we were heading down into dreaded Spring Creek Canyon. It would have been hard and dry weather, but with mud underfoot, with every rock wet and slippery, I wondered if Rosalio and the herd could make it, for at times we went almost straight down. The sheep had to negotiate narrow defiles. At last, the deluge of rain was so bad that we could not travel. Camp was made. The rain turned to hail, and we kept a fire going constantly. Rosalio could not even enjoy the fire. All day long, he had to be out in the mud and cold and hail, hunting forage for the sheep, coming in only at noon and at night. Pablo stayed in camp and cooked. He actually baked bread in the pouring rain. If Rosalio had to be out in the mud at his job of tending the sheep, then Pablo would have good meals ready when his partner returned. I found here that men can rise to great heights of heroism even in a sheep camp. I found that men do not live by bread alone. This weather was also hard on the dogs. They became wet and cold. The burros seemed more dejected than ever. For 9 days we traveled and camped in rain. The moon was nearly obscured by dark clouds swirling overhead. That period of storm in the Sierra Anchas was the hardest part of the trip. When it was over, Pablo at last had an opportunity to dry out camp. Rosalio got out his battered mouth organ. There was rejoicing. Pablo sang as he stirred up a batch of camp biscuits and baked them in the Dutch oven. Squirrels and chipmunks played about our camp. Not only was Pablo skilled at handling burros, but he was an expert cook. Near the camp, I came upon a porcupine which alerted its quills as it heard me. During the long afternoon as we dried out supplies, wild animals often came close about the camp. And then evening. Frijoles, canned goods, biscuits, and strong coffee made up our usual diet. The food was plain, but we were always hungry. Rosalio's last task at night was to bed down his sheep, and often it would be 10 o'clock or later before he would get to his supper. Around the evening campfire, once again, I experienced the feel of solitude. Next, when we awoke, we found that during the night an amazing thing had happened. Sometime in the night, a baby burro had been born. I wanted to make friends with the little fellow, but vaguely, just vaguely, it seemed to have something else on its mind. At first, it did not quite know what, but it learned rapidly. And rapidly also it gained strength, because when we started out later that same afternoon, the baby burro was able to join the trek, trotting along behind its mother and the herd. At last, the Mogollon Rim rose ahead, the final barrier. We started up in the very early morning hours. This climb was a stern ordeal. At times, the heavy yews slipped back in the shaly rock almost as far with each step as they progressed. Sometimes the sheep would have to jump repeatedly to scale a boulder. Carrying my heavy camera and equipment, I had all I could do to make it up. Seeing a buzzard above, Rosalio seemed to sense something wrong. Turning back, he found a lamb wedged between two rocks. Had the herder been less observant, these rocks would have become the gravestone of this tiny animal. Rosalio seldom used the dogs. Dogs run sheep. It is not good for them. But now he knew he would have to do everything possible to get them up this final barrier. So he set the dogs on them. He yelled and shouted. He threw sticks and stones. Often he would aid a lamb over a stiff climb or lean down to give first aid to an injured sheep. It was a writhing, twisting, churning, jumping mass of wool, every animal for itself. In some manner, the herd made it up. The dogs had helped him, so then and there, Rosalio poured a drink for them in the crown of his hat. It was sunset when the last sheep hobbled into camp. wearied not only from this final climb, but worn and lame from 52 days of struggle through deserts, mountains, and forests. Next morning, I went back to look off over the Mogollon Rim and marveled that Rosalio could have brought the herd through that wilderness, one of the wildest countries in all America. We had reached the haven of safety at the home ranch in the White Mountains. Now, all summer long, the sheep would be in grass up to their necks, until in late autumn, snow would drive them southward once more. All summer long, they would have all they wanted to drink from the bubbling streams. As the herd entered the home ranch, the owner was there to make the final count. We had started with 1,547 sheep. The final count revealed that there were exactly 1,547 sheep. Rosalio did not say much when he was told that fact, but the smile on his face spoke volumes. He had done something that few other persons in America could have accomplished. All his sheep had made the journey safely. Sabu the goat had made it. The little lamb that had lost its mother had made it. Even the lame sheep had made the entire trek. Most important of all, Pablo and Rosalio had come through safely. Men who go through great hardships, endure dangers, who camp out nearly every night of their lives so that we may have the things that make American life comfortable and good. Although living primitively and pursuing an age-old occupation, they are heroes in the truest sense. I realized that the sheep business, as it is carried on in this modern day in Arizona, has not changed much from the way it was carried on centuries ago, even in the times of the psalmist David. As the sun rays slanted through the forest until it resembled a cathedral, instinctively, I began reciting the 23rd Psalm. The Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want. He maketh me to lie down in green pastures. He leadeth me beside the still waters. He restoreth my soul. He leadeth me in the paths of righteousness for his name's sake. Yea, though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I will fear no evil, for thou art with me. Thy rod and thy staff, they comfort me. Thou preparest a table before me in the presence of mine enemies. Thou anointest my head with oil. My cup runneth over. Surely goodness and mercy shall follow me all the days of my life, and I shall dwell in the house of the Lord forever.